I'd heard a thunderous explosion outside, as if the sky fell and crashed onto all of Kyo. I hope no one knew I was hurt. I hope no one I knew was hurt. Please, anyone out there, stay safe. I clasped both of my hands tightly and I began to pray to myself for hope. Then I felt a soft hand tap my shoulder with the tips of his fingers.
大丈夫。心配はいらんよ。彼らはきっと無事に戻ってきてくれるさ。池田屋の時だってそうだったじゃないか。
Anyway, I knew that he was trying to comfort me so that I'd remain calm, but the hellish sound of gunfire from the outside, without any idea of what was going on, made it difficult to think about anything else. Doesn't this worry you, Inoue? The Shinsengumi men have been fighting alongside you for years, since Edo too. Inoue gave me a kind smile, tilting his head slightly as he answered.
不安がないと言えば嘘になるがね。人にはそれぞれ命を懸けるべき役目ってものがある。だから焦ったりやけっぱちにならず、その時を待つべきだと、そう考えているだけだよ。
Everyone has roles to play. Inoue had a way with words that subdued my anxieties, even as I grew more nauseous. I wasn't sure if it came off that way to him, but I was becoming almost sick with worry. Thank you, Inoue. I think I understand what you mean. Everyone had roles to play. I guess for me, that meant my role was to treat whoever was injured in this tumultuous time. After all, I was the one who decided to stay back, so I must do everything I can to support them. Just then,
雪村先輩、俺に何かできることはありませんか?
Oh my god, so mine is, blue, well, it's not blues, but I guess we'd call them blues. Soma, who had recently joined the soldiers defending Kyo, was nervous as he asked. Of course, let's prepare our treatment stations. Can you please fetch some water from the well?
わかりました。すぐに。
Soma sprinted towards the well. Okay, so for now, I need to fold my clean cloths, and I need to find some needles for stitches too. As I was making a mental list of necessary supplies.
くそ、三が日も明けねえうちから戦が始まるなんてよ。あいつら、本当に日本人か？せめて七草貝を食うまでは休ませろよな。
Oh my god.
ま、あの池田屋事件だって祇園祭りの宵山の時期だったしな。
Soon after, warriors that I'd seen leave the magistrate to fight were being rushed in for treatment. From what I'd seen, the fighting must be horrible. The soldiers were covered in soot from head to toe. Hey, is everyone safe?
我々はいい。負傷した大使を見てやってくれ。
As Saito had ordered me, I was looking after the maimed men that seemed to pour in. Okay, this may sting a little. Luckily, many of the men I was treating didn't have life-threatening injuries. At least, I could take solace in this, and I approached Nagakura to ask him something. Any word on how the war's going?
それがどうにも芳しくなくてよ。
Huh? But from what Hijikata-san had told me, the Shogunate forces were well armed, and more than enough to handle the Sacho and Kyo.
兵力は明らかにこっちが上なんだが、薩長側はやけに遠くまで届く新型の銃を使ってやがってな。間合いに踏み込む前に撃たれちまう。しかも連発式だから弾込めしてる隙をつくこともできやしねえ。
No. I knew that, despite the bad news Nagakura and Harada were sharing with me, there had to be some good news happening elsewhere from them. Even so, it seemed like the Shogunate was experiencing a tougher fight than they anticipated.
苦しい状況なのは確かだが、副長がこのまま一方的に敗北を喫するとは思えぬ。
だな、あの人の知恵にかけるしかねえか。
とりあえず俺たちは無傷の大使を集めてもう一度撃って出る。佐野、援護してくれるか。
おう、任せとけ。
The man spoke with such fearlessness, as if today were just any other day. Strangely, though, it only served to worsen my anxiousness for what's to come. Afterwards, Nagakura, who volunteered to lead a troop to charge straight through the enemy's front line, was growing more disenchanted. The shogunate army had 15,000 men. The Sacho had less than a third of that, and yet the momentum seemed to be on their side. As the war continued, it wasn't only the Fushimi magistrate that was experiencing harsh fighting. Based on the reports piling in from the fronts, the shogunate and Sacho troops were clashing everywhere men were stationed. This included the Ugeki unit, with whom Ibe was affiliated, around the Yodo domain. I could only imagine where the man who lamented the very idea of war coming to fruition could be at a time as frustrating as this. Was he away from the fighting? Was he hurt at all? Iba, please be safe. The scent of gunpowder stung my nostrils, and I watched the sky darken above. 2 days had passed since the fighting broke out. January 5th, 1868. The frequency of the cannon fire confused me as to whether they were approaching us or if they were celebrating their victory prematurely. All I knew was the cannon fire became non-stop. Several warriors lying injured in bed jumped from the frightening sound.
なんだ今の音は。もしやこの建物が壊されそうになってるのか。
It's all right, everyone. There's no need to worry, so please just rest. I had made attempts to comfort the warriors as they began to panic, but then... It sounded like the cannons were cracking into the building directly, bursting through the walls. The cannon fire was crumbling the roof above, and in the moment, I prepared for it to crash on top of me and kill me, but then...
大丈夫か?
I heard a familiar voice. Heisuke! Sanan-san too! It must have been because the sun was rising, but the two had returned from their night raid. So, how is it out there? Sanan-san's brow furrowed, silently shaking his head.
夜の闇に紛れて大砲を狙い、一定の戦果を上げることはできたのですが。
羅刹隊の人数は限られてるからな。俺たちだけで戦況を覆すのはちょっと無理だ。
Oh no. If our captain's swordsmanship and our fury courts combined weren't enough, then...
ここまでですかね。
Asana-san muttered his cynical musing to himself. Cannon fire rang in the background. Suddenly...
雪村君、無事かね。
Hijikata-san, Inoue!
あんたがこいつをかばってくれたのか。感謝するぜ。三男さん、平助。
Hijikata nodded his head to the two men, and Sanan-san remained stoic, offering no greeting.
土方君、口惜しいですが、もはや体勢は決しました。我が羅刹隊は敵を圧倒していますが、それでもここまで周囲に押し込まれていては意味がない。
Hijikata-san bit his lips, balling his hands into tight fists as his comrade shared his opinion. Hijikata-san's display made each of us aware just how frustrated, how hurt he must have been. In the past, Hijikata-san always seemed 2 steps ahead on the battlefield with his courageousness and his intelligence. So seeing him entertain the idea of defeat seemed like something that was impossible for a man of Hijikata-san's experience to swallow. But eventually...
俺一人ならどんな目に遭わされようと最後の最後まで戦うんだがな。この場はやむを得ねえか。
The word seems to cause him pain as they left his mouth, and he turned to face the captains.
全軍撤退だ。三男さん、平助、しんがりとして援護を頼めるか。
心得ていますとも。
おう、任せてくれって。
I couldn't just sit and listen to them as they prepared to move into action. Is there anything I can do to help? Hijikata-san shot me one of his glances that seemed to indicate to me that he was annoyed. Sanan-san, on the other hand, paused for a moment before answering my question.
では雪村君、君に一つ頼みたいことがあります。我々羅刹隊はこれより全員出撃して敵を食い止めることになりますが、その隙に羅刹について記した資料を井上さんと共に大坂城まで運んでほしいのです。
About the Furies?
これまで多くの犠牲を払い改良を繰り返してきた羅刹の資料、そして何より落ち水が敵側に渡ると厄介なことになります。
I gulped at the thought. I had many horrible feelings towards the serum brought into the Shinsengumi by my father. Understood. I will protect them with my life.
頼みましたよ。持ち出すことが難しいもの、後に代用が効くものはここで焼き捨てます。君と井上さんに託すのは落ち水そのものや材料、そして最低限の書類のみです。
Sanan-san was communicating to me that there could be no mistakes. This was irreplaceable. My legs began trembling as I began to consider the burden of responsibility Sanan-san placed on me. I looked Sanan-san straight in the face and I nodded. Got it.
ではどうぞこちらへ。建物が崩れる前に渡しておかなくては。
We walked down the hallway, walls rumbling from the cannon fire, and Sanan-san handed me the documents before Inoue and I left for Osaka. The amber sun was setting from the smoky sky. Since we'd been retreating with many injured Senshigumi warriors in tow, it was difficult to move quickly, and we were pressed for time. Inoue, do you think everyone else made it out safely?
心配はいらないさ。大坂城へ着けば彼らとは必ず合流できるんだからね。おととい伏見奉行所で言ったことを忘れたわけじゃないだろう。
No, I haven't. Everyone has their role. So no matter what, all I could do was be patient and prevent myself from acting rashly.
日が沈めば銃で狙いをつけるのは難しくなる。もう少しの辛抱だよ。
Walking on unpaved roads, I nodded to Inoue. Just then, an echo of nearby gunshots startled me and I gulped. Inoue ducked down, hiding behind a tree to get a better view of our surroundings.
あの着物は薩長の軍勢のようだね。
His confirmation made me grip the bandana on my waist tightly as my hair stood from fear. Harada had mentioned how these new guns could fire from an even further distance than usual. If we were caught, we'd be done for.
彼らに気づかれないようやり過ごすしかなさそうだ。
Inoue whispered softly, and we hid in the shady bushes as we waited for the men to pass. Oh, Inoue, where are we? As he left the main road to hide from the enemy patrol, Inoue and I had found ourselves separated from the rest of our convoy. During our initial escape, a warrior told us that other domains were joining the war. Domains that had previously declared neutrality were now siding with the Tacho to kill off any shogunate men, including leadership.
おそらく淀のあたりに近づいているのは確かだと思うが。
Yodo. If I remember correctly, Iba's Ugeki unit was close by. Was Iba still safe? Just then,
誰かがこちらへ近づいてくるぞ。雪村君、隠れて。
I hid in the shadows just as Inoue had commanded me to. A few moments later, I heard the taps of footsteps, and a shadow soon followed after. Who could it be? From what I could make out, it looked like a monk. Or could it be a doctor? But what would they be doing out here? As the shadow drew closer, the person's features became a little clearer. Then I gasped. It was... Father? As the words left my mouth, I froze, watching in disbelief to what was happening before me. There stood Father, whom I'd been searching for all this time, Koda Yukimura. As he heard my voice, Father slowly turned around.
その声はそこにいるのかい?
I had longed to hear his familiar voice for so long that I'd almost cried. Inoue, would it be alright if I showed myself to my father? I turned to Inoue, asking for permission despite the possible threat of enemies nearby. However, Inoue's eyes thinned, as if he were still suspicious, but then...
無事な姿を見せてあげたまえ。
He kindly obliged me, bowing his head. I nodded back to Inoue, sharing with him a momentary grin before I walked out of the bushes. Father, is that really you? At long last, it was him. I was flushed with so much emotion that it made me lightheaded. Father smiled brightly, and it seemed like he almost choked up as he greeted me.
久しぶりだね。綺麗になったな。
The only response I could muster was the slow shake of my head. Words struggled to come out. At some point, I honestly started to believe that I would never see him again. But there he was, right in front of me, looking as healthy as I wished he would be.
そちらにおられるのは確か新選組の井上さんでしたかな。娘をここまで連れてきてくださってありがとうございます。
いや、礼には及びません。
Inoue also seemed relatively happy to see that I was reunited with my father. But what are you doing here? Where were you all this time? Father's expression became glum. His eyes tenderly gazed into mine.
長い間頼りも出せずにすまなかった。実は遠く離れたところに囚われていてね。
Taken captive? The horrible image of someone taking my father as a prisoner made me flinch. But father continued on, describing his journey without going into great detail.
お前も新選組に囚われているのだったね。私は お前を探しに来たのだよ。もしお前が今回の戦に巻き込まれて命を落としてしまったらと、それだけが気がかりでね。
Father. As he recounted his story, I could feel the anguish he must have been experiencing. I didn't want him to worry anymore. There was so much I needed to ask him, so much I've been wondering all this time. Now, Father, let's go to Yodo Castle. The Shinsengumi has men there, and I'm sure they will keep us safe from the Sacho troops. In response, however, my father shook his head slowly.
残念だが、大坂城には行かないのだよ。私も、お前もね。
Father? What Father said it seemed a little strange, and his tone became stern, confusing me somewhat. If he were an ally of the Shinsengumi, surely he would seek to rejoin them or contact the Tokugawa clan for aid. So why? Then it hit me. Father had said he was taken captive to some place far, far away. So how did he have any idea that I had been staying with the Shinsengumi all this time? The pieces weren't adding up, and the sense of unease worried me so much I began to back away.
今の言葉は一体どういう意味ですかな。
Inoue stepped in front of me, guarding me as he seemed to pick up on the inexplicable strangeness. Then Father's tone became completely cold, one which was completely alien to me.
決まっているではないか。娘は新選組には返さぬと言っているのだ。
Why must you ruin good things, Kodo? You could have just had a life. But no. You choose this path every single fucking time. A haunting chill crept down my spine. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was there. This wasn't the father I knew. Just then, I sensed someone was standing behind me. I turned around. I saw Takeda! It was Takeda, the Shinsengumi's former captain of the 5th Division. Inoue's eyes widened incredulously at the sight.
武田君、あんたは切られて死んだと聞かされていたのに、生きていたのか。
生きていたんだよ。そこにいるジジイに助けられてね。
Well, fuck.
なんだって。
Father had saved Takeda's life? A man who called me a monster, who threatened to reveal all of the Shinsengumi secrets, was working with my father? He must have been the one who had informed my father of my involvement with the Shinsengumi. As I attempted to make sense of all of this information, Father seemed ambivalent to my reaction, smiling straight at me. Then he reached his hands out to me, the same hands that used to comfort me as a child.
さあ、私たちと行こう。何も迷うことはないだろう。
I couldn't bring myself to accept his hand as easily as I would have in the past.
雪村君、行動さんは信用できるかい。
Inoue whispered discreetly to me. Before I left for Kyo, and before I had met everyone in the Shinsengumi, taking Father's hand wouldn't have required a second thought. However, I was far too bothered by something to not be suspicious by all this. More than anything too, Sanon-san, Heisuke, Hijikata-san, and the rest of the Shinsengumi had placed their faith in me. As it stands, I trust in the men of the Shinsengumi far more than I trust my father. Inoue smiled kindly to my response, And it was in that moment that I made up my mind.
そうか。ありがとう。
Then he reached his hand to grip the sword on his waist, unsheathing it with a quick movement.
ここは私が引き受けよう。君は先に行きなさい。
His words slunk heavily, as if there was some finality to them, and it made me nervous. It was as if he didn't expect to come back with me eventually. Inoue? I anxiously called out to him, my voice shaky, but he looked at me with tired eyes, grinning once more.
大丈夫。私はこれでも新選組の組長だよ。時間を稼いだらすぐに後を追うさ。ここから一番近くにいるのは淀方面で戦っている遊撃隊だ。そこまで逃げれば伊庭君がいるはずだよ。
I gasped.
絶対に死なないでくださいね。
That is the wrong background. Because that line did not happen in that specific location.
危険だと思ったらどんな手を使ってでも逃げて生き延びてください。今日君の願いを聞くべきじゃなかった。無理やりにでも大坂城に連れて行くべきだったって。僕を後悔させるような結末にはしないと約束してください。
I made a promise to Iba. A promise that he wouldn't have to regret his trust.
さあ、生きたまえ。君は君の務めを果たしなさい。
I understand. We had a thing. We gotta do it. I understand. There was no way I could be okay with abandoning Inoue, but if I wished to fulfill my duties for the Shinsengumi and honor the trust Sanan-san placed in me, this was the only choice I had. Understood. I couldn't even look Inoue in the face as I answered him, so I kept my head facing the ground. However, I kept myself from crying as I continued to speak.
いい子だ。君に危ない真似はさせられんよ。もし君をここで死なせてしまったら、伊庭君にどれだけ恨まれるかわからない。
I knew that Inoue had said so jokingly, but the unspoken alternative made me want to cry. There were simply no words to say in return. Inoue had pointed the tip of his katana towards Takeda and my father.
行きなさい、雪村君。
I have to say something. I began to realize that this could be the very last time I see Inoue for as long as either of us live. I opened my mouth, and it was agape as I struggled to find anything meaningful to say. Then Inoue screamed at me, turning the pit of my stomach inside out.
行けと言っているだろう。
I shut my eyes tightly and I turned around to run away. Then, promise me that we'll meet back at Osaka Castle. I'll be waiting. With that, I broke into a sprint away from them. Inoue told me the other day that everyone has their role to play in times of war. That we couldn't afford to be impatient. Now I think I finally hit the time Inoue had been talking about. There was no reason for people to die needlessly when they still have a purpose to serve. Under the blood-red sky, I repeated this sentiment over and over again to push myself, one leg after the other, through the mountainous path.
勇さん、トシさん、私にも今ならよくわかるよ。こうして誰かのために体を張る、これも一つの武士の形だと。